The calm before the storm. It was a crisp afternoon in mid-October. The streets of Maplewood, a small Ohio town, were lined with trees shedding their golden leaves. Life here was slow-paced. Everyone knew everyone, and the routines were as predictable as the change of seasons. At the heart of the community was Parker's Market, a locally owned grocery store that had served the town for over 3 generations. It was a place where neighbors caught up on news, parents shopped with their kids after school, and retirees ambled leisurely down the aisles. Darrell Carter was no stranger to the store. At 28, he had lived in Maplewood his entire life. Known for his warm demeanor and quick smile, he was the kind of person who always stopped to help someone struggling with their groceries or held the door open for a stranger. That day, he had just finished his shift at the community center, where he worked as a youth counselor. His plan was simple: grab a few groceries, cook dinner, and unwind after a long day. Dressed in a navy hoodie and jeans, Darrell walked through the automatic doors, his phone buzzing with texts from his younger sister. She was a college freshman, and her latest string of messages was a mix of complaints about midterms and excitement about her dorm's upcoming talent show. He chuckled softly as he typed a quick reply while steering his basket into the produce section. Nearby, an elderly woman named Martha was adjusting her reading glasses, squinting at the price tags on a display of apples. Martha had lived in Maplewood for over 50 years. Widowed and in her late 70s, she was a fixture in the community. Known for her no-nonsense attitude, she was often seen bustling about, her silver hair pinned neatly under a beret. But Martha had a sharp tongue, and her opinions, unfiltered and often outdated, had a way of turning heads. As Darrell reached for a bag of oranges, Martha noticed him out of the corner of her eye. Something in her expression shifted. Her warm smile, which she had been offering to everyone she passed, hardened into a frown. Her posture stiffened, and she muttered something under her breath. Darrell, engrossed in his phone, didn't notice. He was debating whether to add lemons to his basket when her voice cut through the air, sharp and deliberate. "You people are everywhere these days," she said, loud enough to turn heads. Darrell froze. He blinked, unsure if the words were meant for him. Slowly he looked up, his brows furrowed in confusion. "Excuse me," he said, his tone calm, but edged with disbelief. Martha turned to face him fully now, her eyes narrowing. "I said, you don't belong here. Why don't you go back to where you came from? Back to Africa, or wherever it is." The store seemed to hold its breath. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A young couple near the bakery exchanged uneasy glances, and a cashier stopped scanning groceries to watch. The hum of the store's usual activity gave way to a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Darrell's mind raced. A dozen emotions surged through him: shock, anger, disbelief, but he kept his face calm. He had been in situations like this before. Growing up black in a predominantly white town meant he had learned to pick his battles, to navigate prejudice with a mix of grace and resolve. But this was different. This wasn't a muttered comment in passing or a sideways glance. This was direct, public, and loud. He took a deep breath, setting his phone down in his basket. The weight of her words pressed against him, but he stood tall, meeting her glare with steady eyes. "Ma'am," he began, his voice even, "what you just said, do you realize how hurtful and ignorant it sounds?" Martha sniffed, clutching her bag of apples tightly. "I said what I said. This is my country, and people like you don't belong here." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. A young mother ushered her child down another aisle, avoiding the tension entirely. A teenager near the canned goods section pulled out his phone, clearly recording the exchange. Darrell didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, giving her words time to settle, not just for Martha, but for everyone within earshot. He could feel the weight of the stares, the collective anticipation of the crowd. He could yell. He could walk away. But neither option felt right. He straightened his posture, his expression calm but resolute. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the growing audience. "This is your country, but it's mine too." Martha scoffed, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes as Darrell continued. "You see, my great-great-grandfather was brought to this country against his will, enslaved to build the very foundation of this nation. My grandfather fought in World War II for the freedoms we all enjoy today. And my parents, they raised me to believe in hard work, respect, and kindness, even in the face of ignorance." The crowd, which had been quietly observing, began to shift. An older man near the deli nodded slightly, his expression thoughtful. A teenage girl whispered something to her friend, both of them watching intently. Darrell's gaze didn't waver. "So when you tell me I don't belong, you're not just insulting me. You're dismissing the sacrifices of generations of my family who helped shape this country. You're erasing their stories, their struggles, and their contributions." Martha's face flushed. She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, as if unsure what to say. The crowd's attention was no longer split. Every pair of eyes was on her, waiting to see how she would react. Darrell took a step back, his tone softening but losing none of its strength. "Ma'am, I'm not here to argue or to make a scene, but I will not let ignorance go unchecked. Words matter, and they have consequences. We can do better than this. We have to." The silence that followed was deafening. Martha's grip on her cart tightened, her knuckles white. She glanced around, perhaps searching for support, but found none. The weight of the moment seemed to press down on her, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. A young cashier broke the silence. "That was powerful," she said quietly, her voice tinged with awe. Darrell offered her a faint smile before turning back to his basket. The crowd slowly began to disperse, the tension in the air giving way to a subdued murmur. Some people avoided Martha entirely, while others glanced at her with expressions that ranged from disapproval to pity. As Darrell moved toward the checkout line, he noticed the teenager with the phone giving him a thumbs up. "Thanks," the boy mouthed, his voice barely audible. Darrell nodded in acknowledgement, his heart still heavy, but his resolve intact. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the parking lot. Darrell loaded his groceries into his car, the weight of the encounter still fresh in his mind. He had done what he believed was right, but he knew the story wasn't over. Moments like these didn't end neatly. They lingered, shaping the people who experienced them. As he drove away, he couldn't help but wonder, had his words made a difference? Could Martha, or anyone else who witnessed the exchange, truly change their perspective? Only time would tell. But for now, he was content knowing he had spoken his truth with dignity and strength. It was a start. The ripple effect. The days following the encounter at Parker's Market were anything but quiet. In the small town of Maplewood, news traveled fast, especially when it involved a public confrontation like the one between Darrell and Martha. The story spread from one end of town to the other, whispered over cups of coffee at the diner, shared during Sunday service, and debated at the barbershop. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what had happened, and no one was entirely indifferent. For Darrell, life moved forward, though not without reminders of that day. He returned to work at the community center, throwing himself into his duties with the kids he mentored. Many of them looked up to him, and he was determined to show them what resilience and dignity looked like in the face of adversity. But even in the safe haven of his workplace, the encounter lingered. Mr. Darrell, a boy named Marcus, asked one afternoon while they were painting a mural in the gym. Marcus was just 12, but he had a maturity that often startled people. "My mom said you stood up to that mean lady at the store. Is that true?" Darrell paused mid-stroke, setting his paintbrush down carefully. He turned to Marcus and smiled faintly. "Yeah, I did," he admitted. "But it wasn't about standing up to her. It was about standing up for what's right." Marcus looked thoughtful, his small hands gripping the handle of his brush. "Did it hurt your feelings?" "What she said, I mean." Darrell hesitated. He didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to unload the weight of that moment onto a kid. It stung, he admitted finally, but I didn't let it stop me. You see, people can say hurtful things, but how we respond matters even more. You always have the power to choose kindness, even when it's hard. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression serious. I want to be like that, he said softly. Like you. Daryl felt a lump rise in his throat, but he managed to smile. You already are, he said, patting the boy's shoulder. Meanwhile, Martha was struggling to come to terms with what had happened. The confrontation had left her feeling exposed in a way she hadn't expected. She hadn't been prepared for Daryl's calm, unwavering response, or the silent judgment of the crowd that had witnessed it. For days, she replayed the incident in her mind, her thoughts a tangled mix of anger, embarrassment, and something she couldn't quite name. Guilt, perhaps. Her routine trips to Parker's Market became a source of anxiety. She avoided the produce section entirely, taking care to shop at odd hours when the store was less crowded. Still, she couldn't escape the whispers or the subtle glances from other shoppers. Even the cashiers, who had always greeted her warmly, seemed a little cooler, a little more reserved. One evening, Martha sat at her kitchen table, staring at the same floral-patterned tablecloth she'd had for years. It was covered in old family photos she had pulled from a dusty box in the attic. Images of her late husband, her children, and her grandchildren stared back at her, their frozen smiles a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt inside. She lingered on a photo of her youngest granddaughter, Lily. At just 8 years old, Lily had a way of seeing the world that was both innocent and wise. Martha thought of the stories Lily often shared about her diverse group of friends at school. Their shared laughter, their innocent friendships unmarred by the prejudices of the adult world. Lily didn't see color the way Martha had been taught to. And maybe, Martha thought, that was the way it should be. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the phone. Dialing a number she hadn't called in years, she waited, her heart pounding as the line rang. When a voice answered on the other end, Martha hesitated before speaking. Hi, Carol, she said finally, her voice unsteady. It's Martha. I was wondering if we could talk. Carol was an old friend, someone Martha had drifted apart from years ago, partly because of their differing views on race and politics. Carol had always been outspoken, challenging Martha's beliefs in ways that had felt uncomfortable, even threatening. But now, in the wake of what had happened, Martha found herself seeking that same discomfort. She didn't know what she was looking for. Clarity, maybe, or just a sense of where to go from here. As the days passed, Daryl began to notice subtle changes in the community. People who had witnessed the confrontation, or heard about it, started to approach him in unexpected ways. At the coffee shop, a man he barely knew stopped him to say, I just wanted to thank you for how you handled things at the store. It gave me a lot to think about. At church, an elderly woman pulled him aside after the service. I've lived in this town my whole life, she said, her voice trembling. And I'm ashamed to say, I've heard things like that before and stayed silent. But seeing you stand your ground, it's made me realize silence isn't an option anymore. Even online, the story took on a life of its own. The teenager who had recorded the incident posted the video to social media, where it quickly gained traction. Comments poured in from strangers near and far, praising Daryl's composure and courage. But with the praise also came vitriol. Trolls accused him of being too sensitive, or playing the victim. Daryl ignored them, focusing instead on the overwhelming support. One message, however, stood out. It was from a young black man named Elijah who lived in a neighboring town. I saw your video, and I just wanted to say thank you. Elijah wrote, I've had moments where I wanted to speak up but didn't know how. Watching you showed me it's possible to stand tall without losing yourself. You inspired me. Daryl responded to Elijah, encouraging him and offering his support. The exchange left him feeling hopeful, a reminder that even small actions could ripple outward in ways he couldn't always see. One Saturday afternoon, Daryl returned to Parker's Market. This time, he wasn't alone. He had brought his mother along, partly for company and partly because she had insisted on showing him the proper way to pick ripe avocados. As they wandered through the aisles, a familiar figure caught his eye. Martha was standing near the bread section, her cart half filled with groceries. For a moment, their eyes met. Darrell saw hesitation in her gaze, and perhaps something else, an unspoken apology. To his surprise, Martha began walking toward him. His mother noticed too, pausing to watch the interaction. Martha stopped a few feet away, her hands gripping the handle of her cart tightly. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. I wanted to say, I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what I said, and I realize now, it was wrong. I was wrong." Darrell blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected an apology, let alone one so public. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone genuine. "That means a lot." Martha nodded, her eyes glistening. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm trying to do better, to be better." Darrell offered her a small smile. "That's all any of us can do." As Martha walked away, Darrell's mother placed a hand on his arm. "Proud of you, son," she said quietly. "Takes strength to stand up, but it takes even more to inspire change." Darrell didn't respond right away. He watched as Martha disappeared down the aisle, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. The ripple effect of that moment at the store was still unfolding, and though the road to understanding was far from over, it was a start. Seeds of change. The air in Maplewood was different now, like the quiet after a storm when everything feels fresher, but also unsettled. Darrell's confrontation with Martha had become more than a local incident. It was a catalyst. Conversations that had long been whispered in corners or swept under rugs were now happening openly. Families talked about it at dinner tables, teachers brought it up in classrooms, and even the town council found itself grappling with the deeper issues the moment had unearthed. For Darrell, the days after Martha's apology were a mix of relief and new challenges. He didn't seek attention for what had happened, but it found him anyway. People approached him on the street to share their gratitude or their own experiences. Local reporters requested interviews, and a few out-of-town activists even reached out, asking if he would speak at their events. Darrell declined most of the offers. His goal had never been to seek the spotlight. It was to confront an injustice in a way that felt true to who he was. But even as the story spread and the town began to shift, Darrell couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done. Change, he knew, wasn't something that happened overnight or in a single encounter. It was a process, a series of small, deliberate steps taken by people willing to challenge not just others but themselves. One afternoon, Darrell decided to visit the community library, a place he often went when he needed to clear his head. The library, with its tall shelves and sunlit reading nooks, had been his refuge since childhood. It was where he first fell in love with history, spending hours poring over books about the civil rights movement, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman. Their stories had shaped his understanding of the world and his place in it. As he browsed the shelves, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from Elijah, the young man who had reached out to him online after seeing the video. "Hey Darrell," the message read. "I've been thinking about organizing a community dialogue in my town, something to bring people together and talk about race and respect. Would you be willing to help me plan it?" Darrell smiled as he read the message. He had been impressed by Elijah's determination and vulnerability in their earlier exchanges. This felt like the kind of step forward he wanted to see, not just reactions to incidents, but proactive efforts to build bridges. Without hesitation, he replied, "Absolutely. Let's set up a time to talk." Meanwhile, Martha was taking her own steps toward change. After her apology to Darrell, she had felt an unexpected lightness, as if a burden she hadn't even realized she was carrying had been lifted. But that lightness was tempered by the knowledge that her words had caused harm, a harm she couldn't undo but hoped to repair. One of the first people she called was her granddaughter Lily. Lily, with her bright eyes and infectious energy, was Martha's window into a world that felt both exciting and intimidating. They often talked about school, books, and Lily's dreams of becoming a veterinarian. But today, Martha wanted to have a different conversation. "Lily," Martha said, her voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, Grandma," Lily replied, her tone curious. If I said something that was wrong, hurtful, even, do you think people can change? Do you think it's ever too late?" Lily was quiet for a moment, her young mind clearly processing the question. "I think people can change," she said finally, "but they have to really want to. And they have to listen." Martha felt a pang in her chest. "Listen," she repeated softly. "That's harder than I thought it would be." In the weeks that followed, Martha made a conscious effort to educate herself. She borrowed books from the library, attended a discussion group at her church, and even started watching documentaries about the history of race in America. Some of it was deeply uncomfortable. She hadn't realized how much of her understanding of the world had been shaped by stereotypes and assumptions. But with each new perspective, she felt herself growing. One Saturday morning, she decided to attend a community workshop hosted by the local NAACP chapter. She had never set foot in one of their events before, partly out of fear and partly because she didn't think it was her place. But now, she felt it was something she needed to do. When she arrived, she was greeted warmly by a woman named Patricia, who introduced herself as the chapter's president. Patricia was about Martha's age, with a kind smile and an air of quiet authority. "We're glad you're here," Patricia said, offering Martha a seat. The workshop focused on implicit bias and how to recognize it in daily life. As Martha listened to the stories people shared, stories of microaggressions, systemic inequities, and personal struggles, she felt both humbled and inspired. It wasn't just about learning facts. It was about connecting with the humanity of others, about seeing the world through their eyes. At the end of the session, Martha approached Patricia. "Thank you for this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I have a lot to learn, but I want to be better." Patricia placed a hand on Martha's arm. "That's the first step," she said gently, "acknowledging where we've fallen short and being willing to grow. Keep going. You're on the right path." As the weeks turned into months, the seeds of change planted that day at Parker's Market began to take root. Daryl and Elijah's dialogue event in the neighboring town was a success, drawing people from all walks of life to share their experiences and listen to one another. Daryl spoke about the importance of empathy and the courage it takes to confront ignorance with grace. Elijah, inspired by Daryl's example, shared his own story of finding his voice. In Maplewood, Martha started volunteering at the community center where Daryl worked. It was an unexpected but welcome surprise when she showed up one afternoon, asking if there was anything she could do to help. Daryl, though initially wary, saw the sincerity in her eyes and welcomed her aboard. She began by organizing supplies and cleaning up the art room. But over time, she started interacting more with the kids. They took to her quickly, drawn to her stories about her own childhood and her knack for baking cookies that always seemed to disappear within minutes. One day, Marcus, Daryl's young mentee, asked her, "Miss Martha, why did you want to come here?" Martha hesitated, then said, "Because I realized I wasn't always the kind of person I wanted to be, and I wanted to do something to change that." Marcus tilted his head thoughtfully. "Well, I think you're pretty cool now." Martha laughed, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Marcus. That means more than you know." For Daryl, seeing Martha's transformation was both surprising and rewarding. It reinforced his belief in the power of speaking up and the importance of grace. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible, and it was worth it. The town of Maplewood wasn't perfect, and it still had its share of challenges. But something had shifted. People were talking, learning, and listening in ways they hadn't before. And while the road ahead was long, it was a road they were now walking together, bridging the divide. The cold of winter settled over Maplewood, its streets blanketed in a quiet layer of snow. The once vivid colors of autumn had given way to the gray stillness of December. Yet beneath this surface calm, the town was alive with subtle changes, ripples from the confrontation at Parker's market that continued to spread. Darrell had been busy. His work at the community center had taken on new dimensions since the incident. Inspired by the dialogue event he had co-hosted with Elijah in the neighboring town, Darrell had begun planning a similar initiative in Maplewood. His goal was simple but ambitious: to create a safe space where people from different backgrounds could come together, share their experiences, and learn from one another. The idea wasn't without resistance. Maplewood, for all its charm, was a town resistant to change. Some residents felt uncomfortable with the growing conversations around race and equity, dismissing them as unnecessary or divisive. Others simply didn't want to confront the biases they had long ignored. Darrell knew this, but he also knew that meaningful change often required stepping into discomfort. On a chilly Friday evening, the Maplewood Community Center gymnasium was transformed into a meeting space. Rows of folding chairs faced a small stage, and tables lined the walls with coffee, hot cocoa, and snacks. A banner above the stage read, "Building Bridges, a Community Conversation." Darrell had spent weeks organizing the event, reaching out to local leaders, inviting guest speakers, and promoting it in every way he could. He wasn't sure how many people would show up, but he hoped for a decent turnout. As the clock neared 7 p.m., people began trickling in. Some came out of curiosity, others out of a genuine desire to engage. There were families with children, young professionals, retirees, and even a group of high school students who had heard about the event from their history teacher. Among them was Martha. Dressed in a warm wool coat and clutching a notebook, Martha entered the gymnasium with a mixture of nerves and determination. She had been attending workshops and reading everything she could about race and equity, but this was the first time she would be part of a larger public discussion. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew she needed to be there. When Darrell spotted her, he smiled warmly and walked over. "Mrs. Martha," he said, his tone welcoming, "I'm glad you came." "I wasn't sure I'd have anything useful to say," she admitted, glancing around at the growing crowd, "but I thought it was important to listen." "That's more than enough," Darrell assured her. "Sometimes, listening is the first step toward understanding." By the time the event began, the gym was nearly full. Darrell took the stage, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The room quieted as he adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "This isn't an easy conversation, but it's a necessary one. We're here to talk about our experiences, our differences, and how we can work together to make our community stronger." He introduced the evening's format, a mix of personal stories, small group discussions, and an open forum for questions. He also laid down some ground rules: respect, active listening, and a commitment to honest but constructive dialogue. The first speaker was Patricia, the president of the local NAACP chapter. She shared a moving account of her experiences growing up in Maplewood during the 1960s, when segregation was still a reality in nearby towns. Her story was one of resilience and hope, but also a reminder of the deep scars left by prejudice. Next, a high school senior named Ava took the stage. Ava was biracial and had written a powerful essay about the challenges of navigating her identity in a town where she often felt like she didn't fully belong to any group. Her words resonated deeply, especially with the younger audience members, who gave her a standing ovation. As the evening progressed, the small group discussions began. Chairs were rearranged into circles, and attendees were encouraged to share their thoughts and experiences. Martha found herself in a group that included a young black mother, a retired police officer, a college student, and a local business owner. At first, the conversation was hesitant, marked by polite but guarded comments. Then, slowly, people began to open up. The young mother, whose name was Angela, spoke first. "I moved to Maplewood because I wanted my kids to grow up in a safe, tight-knit community," she said, But I'd be lying if I said it's been easy. There are times when I feel like no matter how hard I try, I'll always be seen as an outsider. The retired police officer, a man named Ed, nodded thoughtfully. I've lived here all my life, he said. And I'll admit, I've probably turned a blind eye to things I shouldn't have. But lately, I've been wondering what I can do to make things better. That's why I'm here tonight. Martha listened intently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated. I'm still learning, she began, her voice trembling slightly. But I realize now that learning means facing things about myself that I didn't want to see. That day at the grocery store, I said something terrible, something that came from ignorance and fear. But Daryl, he didn't respond with anger. He responded with grace, and that moment changed me. Her voice broke, and she paused to compose herself. I'm here tonight because I want to do better. And I want to thank people like Daryl for showing me that it's never too late to change. There was a moment of silence, and then Angela reached over and placed a hand on Martha's. Thank you for sharing that, she said warmly. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. As the evening drew to a close, Daryl returned to the stage. Tonight, we've heard stories that challenge us, that inspire us, and that remind us of our shared humanity, he said. This is just the beginning. Change doesn't happen in a single conversation or a single event. It's something we build together, one step at a time. The room erupted into applause, and Daryl felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had hoped to spark a dialogue, but what he saw tonight was something more, a community beginning to heal, to grow, and to bridge its divides. As people began to leave, Martha approached Daryl. I don't know if I'll ever be able to thank you enough, she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You don't have to thank me, Daryl replied. Just keep showing up. That's how we move forward. In the weeks that followed, the momentum from the event continued. Small discussion groups began meeting regularly. Schools introduced new curriculum focused on diversity and inclusion, and local businesses displayed signs that read, "All are welcome here." For Daryl, the experience reaffirmed his belief in the power of community and the importance of standing up for what's right. And for Martha, it marked the beginning of a journey she never thought she'd take, a journey of unlearning, of growth, and of building bridges where walls once stood. Though the road ahead was long, Maplewood was taking its first steps together, guided by the belief that change was not only possible but necessary. And in the quiet strength of those steps, hope found a way to bloom. Unlikely allies. Winter deepened, draping Maplewood in a quiet stillness. The snow-covered streets and frost-touched windows gave the town a postcard-perfect appearance, but beneath the surface, the community was stirring. The ripple effects of Daryl's confrontation with Martha, the dialogue event, and the ongoing discussions were reshaping the way people saw each other and themselves. Daryl continued to immerse himself in the work of building bridges. The Maplewood Community Center, which had long been a space for youth activities and fitness classes, was now also becoming a hub for deeper conversations and collaboration. Daryl, along with a small group of volunteers, had started a program called Shared Voices, designed to foster understanding through storytelling and shared experiences. But the work wasn't easy. For every person who embraced the opportunity to grow, there were others who resisted. Some dismissed the conversations as unnecessary wokeness, while others quietly withdrew, unwilling to examine their beliefs or confront uncomfortable truths. Daryl had expected this, but it didn't make the resistance any less disheartening. One morning, as he reviewed plans for the next Shared Voices session, Daryl's phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello, is this Daryl Carter?" The voice on the other end was warm but tentative. "Yes, this is Daryl." "Who's calling?" "This is Carol Brooks. I'm an old friend of Martha Jenkins. She's mentioned you a few times recently." Daryl raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, what can I do for you, Ms. Brooks?" "Well, Carol began. Martha told me about what happened at the store, and about everything that's come after. She said you've been organizing events and working with the community. I think that's wonderful. And well, I was hoping I could meet with you. There's something I'd like to discuss. Daryl agreed, and they arranged to meet at a local coffee shop that afternoon. When Daryl arrived, Carol was already seated at a corner table, a steaming mug of tea in front of her. She was a petite woman in her 70s, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and her demeanor was calm but purposeful. "Mr. Carter," she said, rising to shake his hand. "Thank you for meeting with me." "Please call me Daryl," he replied, taking a seat across from her. Carol smiled. "Daryl, then. I'll get straight to the point. I've lived in Maplewood for over 40 years, and I've seen this town change a lot. And not always for the better. There's been too much silence around the things that really matter. And while I'm not proud to admit it, I've been part of that silence." Daryl nodded, listening intently. "Martha and I have known each other for decades," Carol continued. "We haven't always agreed on things, but we've always been honest with each other. When she told me about what happened between you two, I'll admit, I was shocked. Not just by what she said, but by how you handled it. It's given me a lot to think about." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. "I want to help," she said finally. "I don't know how much use I'll be, but I feel like I can't sit on the sidelines anymore. So, if there's anything I can do, anything at all, I'd like to be involved." Daryl was taken aback. While he had seen Martha begin her journey of change, he hadn't expected it to inspire others, let alone one of her closest friends. "That means a lot, Ms. Brooks," he said sincerely. "And I think there's definitely a role for you. Shared Voices is always looking for people to lead discussions or share their stories. Would you be open to that?" Carol hesitated. "I'm not much of a public speaker," she admitted, "but I do have some connections in town. Maybe I could help get more people involved, especially some of the older folks who might not feel comfortable coming to these events. They need to hear these conversations just as much as anyone." Daryl smiled. "That would be perfect. Sometimes, the most effective change starts in small, familiar circles." True to her word, Carol began reaching out to her network. Over the years, she had been involved in various civic groups and social clubs, and she used these connections to encourage participation in the community's growing movement for understanding. She also worked closely with Martha, who had become increasingly vocal about her own transformation. One afternoon, Carol and Martha invited Daryl to speak at their book club, a group composed mostly of retired women who met once a month. Though initially skeptical, the members found themselves deeply moved by Daryl's story and the broader conversation it sparked. By the end of the meeting, several members had volunteered to help with future Shared Voices events. Among them was Eleanor, a former schoolteacher who had lived in Maplewood for over 50 years. She approached Daryl after the meeting, her expression a mix of regret and resolve. "I taught for 30 years, she said, "and I know now that I didn't always do enough to make all my students feel seen and valued. I can't change the past, but I want to be part of making things better for the future. Please let me know how I can help." As more people became involved, the Shared Voices program began to evolve. What had started as small, informal discussions grew into a series of workshops, panels, and community projects. One particularly impactful initiative was the Maplewood Mosaic, a mural project designed to celebrate the town's diversity and shared history. The mural, painted on the side of the community center, featured images of key moments and figures from Maplewood's past, alongside depictions of the town's hopes for the future. Residents of all ages contributed to the project, from young children adding their handprints to senior citizens helping outline the design. Martha, despite her initial reluctance, became one of the mural's most dedicated volunteers, often showing up early to help prepare supplies. One day, as she and Daryl worked side by side on the mural, Martha turned to him. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "if someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be painting a mural about unity with a group of people I barely knew. I would have laughed them right out of the room. Darrell chuckled. Life has a funny way of surprising us, he said. Martha nodded. It does, and sometimes it takes someone else holding up a mirror for us to see who we really are and who we want to be. By the time spring arrived, the mural was complete, and the town of Maplewood felt transformed. The tensions that had simmered beneath the surface for years hadn't disappeared entirely, but they were being addressed in ways that once seemed impossible. New friendships had formed, old wounds had begun to heal, and the community was rediscovering the strength that came from standing together. For Darrell, the journey had been both exhausting and rewarding. There were still moments of doubt, still days when the weight of the work felt overwhelming. But as he stood before the completed mural, surrounded by the people who had helped bring it to life, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change, he realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. And in Maplewood, progress was finally taking root. A new chapter for Maplewood. Spring arrived in Maplewood with a sense of renewal. The air was crisp, the snow had melted into rivulets running along the streets, and the town's vibrant colors were returning. The once quiet streets were now alive with activity, children playing in the parks, neighbors tending to their gardens, and the chatter of conversations that felt warmer and more open than before. The ripple effects of Darrell's confrontation with Martha and the movement it had inspired were undeniable. The mural on the side of the community center stood as a beacon of hope and progress. Its vibrant colors depicted not only the history of Maplewood, but also the shared aspirations of its people. The project had brought the town together in a way no one had imagined possible. For Darrell, seeing it complete was both humbling and invigorating. A reminder that collective action could create something beautiful. But Darrell wasn't one to rest on his laurels. He knew that the mural, the Shared Voices initiative, and even the heartfelt conversations were just the beginning. Real, lasting change required continuous effort. And as much as the town had come together, he was acutely aware that the road ahead was still long. One morning, Darrell received an email that stopped him in his tracks. It was from a member of the Maplewood Town Council, inviting him to speak at an upcoming meeting about the possibility of formalizing some of the community's efforts. The council wanted to discuss creating a permanent diversity and inclusion committee for the town. Darrell read the email twice, his heart pounding. This was more than he had hoped for. A chance to institutionalize the changes the town was experiencing. But it was also daunting. He knew that not everyone on the council was supportive of these efforts, and some would argue that such a committee was unnecessary or even divisive. That evening, he shared the news with his parents over dinner. His father, a man of few words, nodded thoughtfully. "You've already shown this town what's possible," he said. "Now it's time to make it official." His mother, ever his biggest cheerleader, smiled. "Darrell, you have a way of bringing people together. You can do this." Buoyed by their support, Darrell spent the next few days preparing. He worked on his speech, gathered data on the impact of the Shared Voices program, and even consulted with Carol and Martha, who had become two of his most steadfast allies. The night of the town council meeting, the community center was packed. Word had spread quickly, and residents from all walks of life had shown up to hear the discussion. The room buzzed with anticipation as Darrell took his seat near the front. When his name was called, he rose and walked to the podium. The room fell silent. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "I want to thank the council for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm here not just as an individual, but as a representative of the many voices in our community who believe in the power of unity, understanding, and progress." He paused, scanning the room. Over the past few months, Maplewood has begun a journey of reflection, of growth, and of change. Through initiatives like Shared Voices and the Maplewood Mosaic, we've seen what can happen when people come together to share their stories and listen to one another. But we've also seen that these efforts need support to thrive. That's why I'm here tonight, to advocate for the creation of a diversity and inclusion committee that will ensure these conversations continue and that our community remains a place where everyone feels valued and heard. Daryl spoke for 10 minutes, weaving in stories from the Shared Voices sessions, statistics about increased participation in community events, and personal anecdotes that highlighted the impact of the initiatives. He concluded with a simple but powerful statement. Change doesn't happen on its own. It requires intention, effort, and, most importantly, a commitment to one another. Let's make that commitment tonight. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. But the decision was far from made. The council members debated for nearly an hour, their discussion punctuated by public comments. Some residents voiced their enthusiastic support, while others raised concerns about the need for such a committee. A few expressed skepticism, arguing that Maplewood didn't have a problem to solve. Martha, seated near the front, was one of the last to speak. She stood slowly, her hands gripping the back of the chair in front of her for support. "My name is Martha Jenkins," she began, her voice firm despite her nerves, "and I want to share a story. A few months ago, I said something terrible, something ignorant and hurtful. And I said it to the man who is standing before you tonight." The room fell silent as she continued. Daryl didn't respond with anger. He responded with grace. He didn't just forgive me. He inspired me to be better. That experience opened my eyes to things I had never seen before, to truths I had never faced. And it made me realize that change isn't just about other people. It's about all of us. She turned to the council. "If you think Maplewood doesn't have a problem, you're not looking closely enough. But we also have an incredible opportunity to be a model for other towns, to show what's possible when people come together. Please don't let this moment pass us by." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was still. Then, one by one, people began to clap. The sound grew louder, swelling into a standing ovation. After much deliberation, the council voted. By a narrow margin, the motion passed. Maplewood would establish a diversity and inclusion committee. The room erupted into cheers, and Daryl felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. But he also knew this was just the beginning. The committee would need to be built from the ground up, with clear goals, diverse representation, and ongoing community input. It would be a challenge, but Daryl was ready for it. In the weeks that followed, the committee began to take shape. Daryl was appointed as its first chairperson, a role he accepted with equal parts humility and determination. Carol joined as a liaison to local civic groups, and Martha volunteered to serve as a public outreach coordinator, focusing on bringing in older residents who might otherwise feel excluded. The committee's first project was ambitious: a town-wide cultural festival celebrating the diversity of Maplewood's residents. The event, called One Maplewood, would feature food, music, art, and storytelling from different cultures and traditions. Planning was already underway, with volunteers pouring in to help. On the day of the festival, the town square was transformed. Colorful banners fluttered in the breeze, and the air was filled with the scent of international cuisines. Children ran from booth to booth, their laughter mingling with the sounds of live music. At the center of it all was the mural, now adorned with new additions from the festival's participants. Daryl stood near the stage, watching as people of all ages and backgrounds came together. He saw Marcus, the young boy he mentored, laughing with his friends. He saw Martha and Carol chatting with a group of high school students. And he saw countless faces, some familiar, some new, all sharing in the joy of the moment. When it was his turn to speak, Daryl took the microphone and looked out at the crowd. "Today," he said, "we're not just celebrating our differences, we're celebrating our shared humanity. This is what progress looks like, and this is what Maplewood can be, a place where everyone belongs." The crowd erupted into cheers, and as Daryl stepped down, he felt a profound sense of hope. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, he could see the road ahead clearly. Together, they were building something that would last, a new chapter for Maplewood, rooted in understanding, empathy, and a shared commitment to one another.